The Minnesota Education Association document against charters called the proposal, and I quote, insulting, a costly hoax, more bureaucracy, lax standards, and elitist. It claimed that children would be guinea pigs. And finally, that it would open the door to vouchers. Really? From me? I'm a Democrat who opposed private school vouchers. Well, that was it. It was time to break from the unions.
You're listening to the Bold by Choice podcast with Vashanta Harris and Jim Gunner. Real talk about charter schools, from the boardroom to the classroom. Powered by the National Charter Schools Institute.
Welcome back to the Bold by Choice podcast. I'm your friend and colleague, Vashanta Harris. And today is such a special day. We are stepping into a moment that changed everything. The birth of the first charter school law. But this isn't just a policy lesson. It's a personal one as well. It's about courage. It's about creativity and how some really incredible leaders and civic thinkers and bright minds came together collectively to join forces to transform an idea into a national movement. And one of those leaders, a friend and colleague of ours, Ember Reichgott is here with us to share the story.
Excited. Thank you very much.
And we're super excited to have you, Ember. You are special in our hearts for so many ways, as a friend and a colleague and somebody that we've been on this journey for 30 years, but also as the Minnesota State Senator that helped pass the nation's first charter school law. And this is part of the story of the Founders Library and why we're so eager to bring these legacy lessons, because what we want people to hear today is not just the history, but the idea of sticking to something. It's one thing to pass it, and you never pass anything by yourself. It's a team. You're going to hear that from Ember. But it's another thing to stay with it, to care about it, to make sure it gets implemented well. And that's part of the story of chartering.
Well, let's dive right in. Ember, take us back to where it all began.
Well, I just think what Jim said is so important. And the origins of chartering are so important for everyone in the chartering world to know, because it's about the language that we use to describe chartering. It is about the messages and lessons learned. And I think it inspires the people of today who are doing the same battles that we did 30 some years ago. So my hope is that through this and through the amazing work of the National Charter Schools Founders Library, that people will tune in to the origins and use them in their own understanding and education of this great movement. So with that, we will start at the beginning. Now, we all have talked about in previous podcasts that in 1983, there was a big old report that came out called A Nation at Risk. And so the country was really looking at ways to transform education. Well, I was just getting elected to the Minnesota Senate at that time. It was my very first year as a very young 29-year-old senator. And I knew nothing about education, but we had a great governor that I loved. His name was Governor Rudy Perpich. And Governor Perpich really had nothing to do with charter schools, but in many ways, he had everything to do with it. Now, I loved Rudy Perpich because we're both Croatian. Okay, there you go. But here's the deal. Governor Perpich decided to respond to A Nation at Risk with two initiatives called Access to Excellence. This is in the Minnesota legislature. One of them, post-secondary education options. What's that? That's where high school students could attend a college class and get a credit in their high school to graduate. Some students could literally take a whole year of college while still in high school on state funds. It was amazing. And it was popular. Well, it passed eventually. The other one was open enrollment. Open enrollment was something that Governor Perpich wanted because he felt that students should have the right to go to another district, that they should be able to travel to another district if that was more suited to their needs, another public school district. And so he proposed both post-secondary education options and open enrollment around 1985. And let me just say that it was not popular. there was a flurry of opposition, especially to open enrollment. I mean, really strong opposition. As Governor Perpich wrote, the plan was not received warmly at first. In fact, one legislator who sponsored the bill said it was a little like trying to rearrange a cemetery. Okay, so it took a few years. And finally, after a year or so, we had voluntary open enrollment. Okay, school districts could opt in and allow that to happen. Guess what? It happened and the world didn't change. Things still went on. Students got more opportunities. So in 1988, the business partnership, note it was the business community, decided to bring a bill to the legislature and to me as author to create mandatory open enrollment, which would require all districts to accept students unless they were overflowing with students. The bill also had something called mandatory testing. So let me just say that none of these bills, the one I authored or any of the others, passed like Civics 101. Believe me, it was anything but. So I do the open enrollment bill in 1988 along with the business partnership. And the irony was that people were kind of accepting open enrollment. It was happening. They weren't too excited. But the opposition went to mandatory testing. So, and I love this, we sneaked open enrollment through the Senate. And guess what? We just put it on a bill, passed the Senate. The media never knew it for 4 days. All the attention was on mandatory testing. We learned a few lessons there. If you get something passed and it happens, mobilize quickly, get folks to use it. Choice is a powerful constituency, and that prevented the repeal of mandatory open enrollment once it passed. Okay, so how does this relate to charter schools? Well, in 1988, after we passed open enrollment, which I had sponsored, I first heard the word charter schools at the Itasca Conference from President Al Schenker of the American Federation of Teachers. Now, that conference had many members of the business community, legislators, union leaders, and people you know, like Ted Koldery, Joe Nathan, and even John Merrill of PBS television. Schenker was a reformer. He proposed that teams of teachers could lead autonomous educational programs. Well, that fascinated me. Why not have more opportunities for teachers? And why not expand their choices? And then there was Cy Flegel. He came from Harlem, and he was doing some great things with community schools. He was creating new choices in schools in East Harlem, and he talked about that. In 1973, these schools were the worst in New York City. By 1988, students were transferring from prominent West Manhattan schools to attend the 20 East Harlem alternative and traditional high schools. Can you believe that? So why not expand choices for students? So to me, charter schools were the natural extension of public school choice. We had created more access to choices, but now we needed more choices to access. But what if all the choices were the same? Could charter schools be the research and development sector for public education? Well, that night, a few of us sat around a dinner table. Joe Nathan was one of them. The head of the state PTA was another. And we were brainstorming. Okay, and yes, there was a little wine. And we started jotting down ideas on a dinner napkin. You got it? The legislation of charter schools was born on a dinner napkin. It's true. Now, there were other factors. 2 other factors were important in creating charter schools. The Citizens League, under Executive Director Kurt Johnson, chaired it with a committee that Ted Koldery was a member of. They were the first to put the idea to paper in policy form. We've talked about the Citizens League and how important that was. Then Ted Koldery issued his very famous document, "The states will have to withdraw the exclusive." This 1990 paper, later incorporated into a national document, is indeed the foundation for chartering. What does withdrawing the exclusive franchise mean? It says basically that right now, each of 50 states set up its public school system using school districts. In that time, the district was the only organization that could deliver public education to the schools or the children in any one district. They had exclusive territorial franchises. As Al Shanker said, it was a system that could take its customers for granted. So to Ted, the idea of the alternate sponsor, that somebody else could sponsor, somebody else other than the school district could deliver public education, that was critical to producing schools operating in new and better ways. The key point here, this wasn't an initiative from a governor, not even from a legislator. It came from outside the political system, from a policy entrepreneur, from a good government group. When was the last time you've seen that today? Now, another key point, patience, patience, patience. Oh, it wasn't easy to pass chartering. Took 3 years to pass. The first 2 years it passed the Senate, always friendly to choice. Remember, they got open enrollment passed pretty quickly. But the House would hear none of it. So at Ted Coldery's behest, the Commissioner of Education created a working group to improve the bill, and we were starting to get some ground. Now remember where we are in 1990. Let's lay the context. More people are appreciating public school choice. In fact, it was favored 2-1 nationally, and the national conversation was bubbling up. Governor Bill Clinton of Arkansas was the first governor to adopt Minnesota's open enrollment. President George H.W. Bush wants to be the education governor, so he is proposing private school choice or vouchers. And then over next door in Wisconsin, Representative Democrat Polly Williams teams up with Republican Governor Tommy Thompson to pass the first voucher legislation for Milwaukee schools. And then a little-known think tank called Progressive Policy Institute, or PPI, which was part of the center-left Democratic Leadership Council, is looking for good ideas to be alternatives to the left-right debate. And they find Ted Coldery and his paper about withdrawing the exclusive franchise. So now we're up to 1991. We're in Minnesota. I introduced the new and improved bill close to what we have today. But I'm going to pause here because all this happened before chartering was even introduced in its current form in the Minnesota legislature.
Oh, I love hearing you tell this story. I remember the first time I listened to your audiobook, which, friends, by the way, is available. We'll share the link in the show notes. But I want to start, Jim, with you. I'm interested in your thoughts on what was most either unexpected or you found most courageous from the story that we've heard so far.
There's so much to unpack in this, Vashant, and Ember does an amazing job laying it out. But one, I want to link right to our current leaders, and that is oftentimes we have ideas or we think the legislature should do this or that, and we go and we get a lawmaker's ear, whether it's in their office or in the grocery store. And then we're frustrated that they don't go do something with it. And part of the story is that lawmakers come in different ages, different experience levels, different expertise. They can hear the ideas. They might even like the ideas. But to turn that into a blueback or into legislation is a whole nother realm. And so to have Ted Coldery and the business community willing to help map it out on the napkin, but then do the work of turning that into legislative language that a senator can adopt and introduce is a real art and science that's so important, and I think often lost with people that want to get things done right away. And I think there's a great lesson in there of why doing the heavy lifting and helping arm your lawmakers with the tools they need to advocate for the solutions you think are best is so critical for today's leaders.
Absolutely. And Don, I've been thinking about this. I don't know a whole lot about policies. I'm still learning, but I've understood many kind of die in committee. They don't actually make it to the point of being passed. What made this one different in your experience?
Yeah, so that's a great question and a great observation. And I just want to go back to something that Jim said about the nature of legislators. And people run for office because they're good people who care about their community and have some ideas about the direction that the state should head in. But by their nature, legislators are generalists. So legislators are asked to deal with all sorts of issues all the time, ranging from state government operations to the economy to education to the environment. And the legislative agenda is just pretty packed on things. So it really takes something special to break through, to move from something that we're just talking about as legislators to something that we decide we're going to take action on. And Ember used a real key term, and that is policy entrepreneur. And a policy entrepreneur is not just somebody who has a good idea, but somebody who's able to put it into action. So if you think about policy as something that's formed where you have the idea, and then the idea gets kind of crystallized into a paper, and then that paper becomes a draft of a bill, that's all a great start. But a policy entrepreneur is able to take that draft of a bill and then bend the political stream and help frame it in the media and put together all of the different pieces that are needed for folks in the legislature to realize, hey, this just isn't something that we should talk about. This is something that we should take action on. So why do some bills die in committee and others don't? Well, you got to have the politics right. You have to have the framing right. The conditions have to be right. And it's someone like a Ted Coldry who's able to take those different parts and put them all together. So I think that was really a difference maker in this instance, Ted and the team that Ember had put together in the legislature, and the ability to bring all the parts together to make this come together.
I agree with that.
I'm going back to my doctoral dissertation at Michigan State University. Go green. But it's often called the history of charter schools in Michigan, but in reality, it was about a policy entrepreneur at that time named Governor John Engler, and I'm proud to say he's a member of our board at the National Charter Schools Institute and on the National Advisory Board of the Founders Library. But one of the things policy entrepreneurs have, like we think of entrepreneurs in the business world, is they're willing to take a risk.
Yeah.
And they're also prepared with ideas. So when that window of opportunity opens that Ember talked about, they're not looking around for their plan. They're ready to go through that window.
Yeah. And Jim, as you know, that window of opportunity might be a real brief time.
Oh, particularly in politics, Don, right? Timing is everything.
Right? We've talked about this before, but sometimes we think of the right solution at the wrong time is ultimately the wrong solution, because you won't be able to generate enough support for it. The media won't frame it correctly. You're not able to get the politics lining up on it. And I think that's especially true with big disruptive change like charter schools. So if you really think of most of the bills that come through committee, they're kind of marginal. So it's something that fixes the stoplight on the corner of M20 in Pickard, or it's something that addresses, a technology has changed, so we're able to process cans and bottles and recycling easier, but need to do it. But the really big disruptive things that change the game, you need a policy entrepreneur to do it. You need some sort of event or a thing that focuses people's attention. A Nation at Risk did that. You need some proof points to show it could be effective. We see these in Minnesota through schools of choice and through dual enrollment, that choice can work within the public setting. So it really is the combination of all of that that takes the good idea and puts it in the right time in order for it to pass.
Don, I think you're totally right about that, in the sense that I don't think the chartering idea would pass in today's climate. It probably wouldn't have passed in a lot of the last few years. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit as we now go into 1991.
One of the things that's also characteristic of policy entrepreneurs is they're a lot like real estate developers. And here's what I mean by that. They have to be able to look at a blank piece of property and see a vision, see an amazing building built. And they have to be able to help people with that word picture of what could be, what could become. And Ember alludes to that, and she'll tell us more about it, but there wasn't a constituency for charter schools demanding it. This was a vision. This was an idea, what we at the Institute call being stewards of possibility. But somebody's got to sell that vision first, and that's the policy entrepreneur.
That's right. And before we jump into this next segment, Jim, I'd like to invite you to pull in any other leadership lessons that you'd like to share for those who are thinking about being bold in their leadership today.
There's so many leadership lessons in this, but, you know, we like being bold by choice. And I think one of the things that was talked about in this article, and I want to talk about the power of ideas and the power of the pen. That article, the state must withdraw the exclusive, was sent around the country. People read it. They read it multiple times. They still read it today. It's one of the archived pieces in the Founders Library that's accessible to everybody. But it's the power of ideas and writing them down. And it wasn't just to withdraw the exclusive, it was to end a monopoly. I was in Detroit yesterday speaking to charter school leaders, and I said, 30 years ago, there was only one provider of public education in this community. It was the Detroit public school system. Now through chartering, charter public schools educate over half of the students. And so this idea that there could be more than one provider of public education is so key. I think the second piece is that sometimes there's things you can do through better practice, but there's also things that can't be done unless there's systems change or policy change. And that's why this story of chartering and the birth and the passage of the nation's first law is so important. And like anything else, somebody's got to go first. And let's go back to the person that went first.
So now we have this committee that is working on this chartering law, making improvements so that I could then introduce it in 1991. So this is my third year as the Senate author of the charter school legislation, and it now looks a lot like what passed. I introduced the new and improved bill, but I needed to have a House author. So I looked for a woman by the name of Becky Kelso, Representative Becky Kelso. She was a House member from suburban Minneapolis called Shakopee, and she had been on the school board there. And she thought school boards were terribly ineffective against teachers' unions. That made her feel like we needed more choice for parents and more student empowerment. So she gladly went on to the bill as my lead companion in the House of Representatives. I remember when I asked her years later about what she thought about the bill when I gave it to her, she said, "Oh, I had zero confidence it would pass." Now that is where the title of the book came from, Zero Chance of Passage. My House author. That is not who you would normally hear that from. But in the end, she was a critical part of the story. Also, what was happening is that there was another legislator named Representative Ken Nelson from South Minneapolis. He had cut the deal to get that passage of open enrollment. And so the two of them were going to be leaders. And I thought, we've got a real chance now this year. So our plan in 1991 was to get the final legislation past the Senate into the conference committee on the Senate side for the third year in a row, and then get 3 votes from the House side and take it through to the end. Okay, didn't sound hard, just 3 votes. We already got 2, and we thought there'd be a Republican on there, so we got 3 votes. All we got to do is get it in that conference committee. Seemed easy to me, except the unions didn't like that idea. The unions came to the table very late. Now, our conversation with the unions started civilly enough. I was a product of public schools. Not only did I know the union leaders, they were my friends and from my district. The president of the teachers union was my constituent. She had door knocked with me. And the lobbyist was my 9th grade math teacher. Okay, it doesn't get closer than that, right? So we tried really hard, but it got pretty tense. The conversations just didn't go well. The unions were most concerned about unlicensed teachers, post-secondary sponsors, and collective bargaining. The latter one, in my view, was off the table. I mean, we had to somehow have autonomy from collective bargaining with the district. So I would look to compromise the other things. Well, it wasn't enough. Things started to ratchet up. And as happens in any intense political battle, the allegations were flying. The Minnesota Education Association document against charters called the proposal, and I quote, insulting, a costly hoax, more bureaucracy, lax standards, and elitist. It claimed that children would be guinea pigs. And finally, that it would open the door to vouchers. Really? From me? I'm a Democrat who opposed private school vouchers. Well, that was it. It was time to break from the unions. I was a Democrat. These were my friends. They were not in any mood to compromise. And everyone admits now that we probably couldn't have found common ground. So at this point, we needed to go all out. We had a pathway. We had the 3 votes, I thought, in conference committee. Representative Ken Nelson, Becky Kelso, and the Republican were supportive. So you don't break with your friends unless you think you can be successful. Okay, so on to the conference committee. Just think about this. It's in the Senate bill, but it never went through the House of Representatives. They had a hearing, but they laid it on the table because that's what Becky thought was best. Well, I knew we'd have to compromise in conference committee, but I never expected what was in store. There was big pressure on Representative Nelson from a very Democratic union district. We were afraid of a killer amendment that would be a law with a name, charter schools on it, but not really charter schools. And that wouldn't be worth it. Well, we got the killer amendment. Basically, very simply, it said teachers had to be a majority of the board, that only 8 charter schools could be created. But the real killer was not only did you have to have an approval by an authorizer, you had to have double approval. You had to have approval by the State Board of Education as well as the local school district. Well, that was never going to happen. We were never going to have a charter school. So this was the biggest decision of my legislative career. Do we pass a very compromised law and hope to improve it later? Or do we withdraw now and wait to build support for the next year? Like Don was saying, timing is everything. We decided we had to go with it. Next year was an election year. Unions were now riled up. It would just get harder to pass. And as the Speaker of the House said, if it wasn't to happen that year, he later said it probably wouldn't have happened. So I was devastated. I broke into tears as that amendment, that killer amendment, was adopted. As I'm leaving the room, I'll never forget this. One teacher lobbyist was whispering to another, "Don't worry, we have the votes to kill it on the House floor." And I knew that they knew how to count their votes. So now the battleground was moved to the House floor 2 days later. 134 members, 79 Democrats, 55 Republican. 24 hours we had. Unions in full opposition mode. No one would bet on the outcome. So the next day, the motion was made to send the bill back to conference committee. If that motion had passed and had gone back to conference, I don't know if chartering ever would have happened. We saved chartering on that vote by 3 votes. Let me tell you the story, how that happened, because I didn't know about it until I interviewed the Speaker of the House years later. So I was watching the debate, and it did not look good. It looked like it was going to be a very red board, and it was. When the vote went up, there was a lot of no's. I thought we were going down. And as the vote was going on, I'm just thinking, this isn't happening. And all of a sudden, the Speaker of the House, after a number of minutes, takes his gavel and pounds it on the table and says, "The secretary will close the roll." And I look up on my TV screen in my Senate office and I see that chartering was saved by 3 votes. I didn't expect that. How did that happen? I asked the Speaker that years later. Well, you got to understand, only the Speaker of the House sees the cumulative vote total of any vote. Nobody else does. He saw when it was 3 votes ahead, and he closed the roll. 10 members of the House had not voted. They were all Democrats. He closed the roll to save chartering. So he was the secret hero. Now you say, well, how could he have closed the roll when 10 members hadn't voted? Simple. He well knew that those Democrats did not want to vote because they didn't want to have their vote on the board against the unions. So in the end, the hero of this was the Speaker of the House, who had kept his cards to his vest and never let anyone know where he stood, but now we knew. Now, the irony is you'll never find this legislative history on tape because it was all part of this big, larger bill, and the debates and votes and policies were all over the map. But in the end, on that one critical vote, this is important, only 41% of the majority Democratic Party voted to keep the bill moving. 56% of the minority Republicans voted to keep it moving. Now think about that. In a body where DFLers had a strong majority, where the speaker was a Democrat, only 41% of the Democrats kept the bill moving. In the end, we could not have done this without moderates of both parties. It was very bipartisan. And after that vote, it easily passed into law after that on the last day of the session, compromised as it was. So after the session, yes, I was an emotional mess. I thought I'd failed. I'd strained every relationship I'd ever had with unions. And for what? Something that could never create a charter school. I was disappointed and angry about the compromise amendment. Now, I'm going to pause here and share what I learned about this later as I interviewed people for my book. Here's some of the key things I learned. First of all, I realize now, 10 years or in 2010 or whenever this was that I interviewed them, that chartering would not have passed if there hadn't been that narrowing killer amendment by Representative Nelson. He actually didn't devastate the bill, he saved it. So I've always felt that compromise is not defeat. And even though the charter supporters were deeply disappointed, others did not see it that way. Representative Kelso, the House author, said it was spectacular. It was all relative. She thought it had zero chance of passage at all. So I guess it's your point of view. The third point was moderates saved the day. Today, unfortunately, in our political climate, there are no moderates. I don't think we could pass charter schools today, and that's what I meant when I said that earlier. And in retrospect, I've wondered if I could have approached the unions differently. Maybe I could have involved them in earlier discussions. They didn't feel heard when we met. I don't think we could have reached agreement, but maybe if I'd been more interested in finding a compromise and less interested in persuading, being the lawyer I am, perhaps there would have been less rancor. Could we have owned a compromise together? I'll never know. I'll never know. Finally, my last point here, Schenker's vision of chartered schools was different. It involved autonomy within the school itself, with teachers in control. For Schenker, it was all about a shift from traditional unionism like the United Auto Workers to the professionalism of teachers. Schenker was way ahead of his members. Union leaders were dealing with this gigantic shift in unionism, and frankly, they were torn because, as one leader said, she was intrigued by chartering because it was proposed by him, but their local opposed it. So I'm just saying that his idea of chartering never was quite the same. It was always within the school district with collective bargaining, not outside the school district with autonomy from collective bargaining. And I felt that was clear as we went on. There I was, feeling pretty darn low. And much to my surprise, just 2 days later, Senator David Dernberger, our Republican U.S. Senator, lauded the passage of this bill on the U.S. Senate record. Really? Here I thought nothing passed, and he's lauding it. And 5 days later, the chair of that Democratic Leadership Council, Center-Left Council, lauded the passage of the bill by two of us members of the Democratic Leadership Council. Well, the chair of the DLC happened to be a guy by the name of Governor Bill Clinton. So Governor Clinton had just delivered the most important speech of his career at a new Democrat conference, and public school choice and chartering were included in the resolutions passed there. Believe it or not, that was several weeks before the bill passed in Minnesota. How did that happen? Because Governor Clinton had gotten a hold of who? Ted Coldery's paper from the Progressive Policy Institute about withdrawing the exclusive. And Clinton got religion. Clinton had already been traveling 8 months talking about this thing called charter schools before any law had passed or even one school had opened in Minnesota. That is remarkable. And that's why charter schools exploded on the national scene so quickly. When I thought I had failed, it had already been teed up. And I know next week we're going to take on that federal journey with Senator Sternberger. But for now, let's just pause and take a look at what happened in Minnesota.
Oh, thanks for sharing such powerful stories. Don, I want to actually start with you. I was listening to Ember share how moderates saved the bill, right? They saved the day. What does that suggest about the sort of coalition building we could benefit from today?
Sure. So I think a couple of really key points in that are if we want to build a policy that's really sticky, that's going to last for a long time, it needs to have a broad political base and broad support. So oftentimes in a legislative environment, when one of the caucuses has a majority, one of the parties has a majority, it's really easy and really tempting to just advance something on party lines. And sometimes that's the only way some stuff can get done. But a much better, I think, way of doing it in the longer term is trying to create a coalition in which both parties can see some value in that. So moderates for a very long time have kind of been the consensus builders, the ones who've really created change in our political system because they're able to reach across the aisle and see what others want and see the other's perspectives on things. I think one very good lesson in this is that if you want to build something that's built to last from a policy stance, seek bipartisan support in it, because that's the way they can get everybody, people from all sides interested in it. And when you have a change in control, because there will be a change in control, your policy is more likely to withstand it. And that does involve compromise on things, because it's very rare in a legislative environment where you're going to get your idea passed exactly the way you propose it. Again, legislators are generalists, so they see things from different angles. And we like that. That's a good thing for us because we want the people who are representing us to have a broad view on things. But it also means that you're going to have a give and take. There's a great story from Lyndon Johnson. It's a type of quote where I don't really know if it's true, but it's so good, I use it anyway. And I think it was related to the passage of Medicare, where it was very compromised at first. And Johnson had said something along the lines of, I want a loaf, but if I can only get a half a loaf, I'll take my half a loaf. And sometimes if I can only take one slice, I will take that slice. And very few people know the legislative process better than LBJ did. He was a phenomenal legislator, phenomenal deal maker on things. And I think that just shows there's value in taking your slice. And sometimes, like with charter schools, if you can only get 8 passed, if it's a double authorizing practice, that's your slice. And then it becomes your job to use the bipartisan support that you've built to grow it over time into something that becomes impactful for kids.
Don, I can tell you're working on your PhD and you work for the Ford Presidential Library. You are a historian and so thoughtful. One of the things that comes to mind listening to this is the 2006 movie Amazing Grace. And I would encourage everybody to go, I would say rent it, but now you just stream it, right? But it's the story of William Wilberforce in trying to eliminate the Atlantic slave trade. And it is elegant in how it shows the political sausage making, the tricks, as Ember said, of how do you get the right people there and the other people out, and when do you call the votes? But it also shows the sacrifice of that policy entrepreneur, what they're willing to risk, what they're willing to sacrifice, what they're willing to go through because they believe in something so truly. And Ember, I want to just give a shout out to you. I was listening to Brene Brown's book, Dare to Lead, and she talks about Teddy Roosevelt and the quote about it's the person in the arena, the one that's getting bloodied and sweating and tired and beat up. But it's those that are willing to take action versus the critics that sit in the stands that truly count. And I just hats off to you. And I know you're humble. It wasn't just you. There was the team in Minnesota. But the willingness for you all to work together. And it just strikes me that if Forbes had a 30 under 30 in 1991, at 29, passing the nation's first charter school law, you'd have been on that list.
That's very kind, except by that time I had gotten a little more mature and I was 36, so that wouldn't have worked. But I appreciate that. But honestly, like I say, legislators simply lead the charge, but there's a whole lot of folks around it. And in my case, I had this incredible group behind me, the policy entrepreneurs you talked about, really helping along the way. But thank you.
And Jim, I love the examples that you're giving. They're very like real life examples of something that we talk about. There's one thing to pass a law, and then there's another thing about what happens after, and that's building that movement. I'd love to hear some more of your thoughts around that.
Well, Don speaks to this really well. But the one thing about chartering is that we view it as a state legislative strategy. But the strategy does not create schools. It only provides the opportunity for people to try something new and different. And I think that's the beautiful thing of chartering and the way they structured that first national charter school law. It was enabling legislation. It gave people an opportunity to try something different. And that's beautiful. I also love the story about, the old saying, if you want to go fast, go by yourself. If you want to go far, go with others. And Ember and the team that supported her, Don's point about bipartisanship and built to last, all of those things are seminal lessons for us to learn, particularly in a current environment where people want to be purists. Here's the litmus test. Well, you can see where chartering brought a lot of different coalitions and interests together to create something that proudly, I'll say, spread and has lasted to now, I think, what's the count? 46 states that have charter school laws, 8,000 schools. That's pretty amazing.
I think it's 48 now. Some of them haven't actually gotten charters up and running yet, but I'm amazed that I think the last one was North Dakota. I never thought they'd do
it. Look at that. And the movement continues. Well, there's a lot to be learned here. And I think there are a lot of things that those of us who are working in the space, regardless of what our roles are, can really glean. So Jim, would love to hear some of your leadership lessons from this second half of the story.
Well, if we cited Clayton Christensen, who talked a lot about creative destruction and disruptive innovation, chartering was that. And Ember, I believe you and the Minnesota team actually got an award from Harvard somewhere along the line for chartering as a disruptive innovation.
We did. And I was really proud of that because we accepted the award with the head of the Citizens League, who sort of led that disruptive innovation. And it is called Innovations in American Government. And it was given by the Kennedy School at Harvard. And it was the Ford Foundation, Harvard University, Kennedy School of Government that put it together. And in 2000, we were awarded the Innovation in American Government for policy that passed. And I was proud of that. And it was an award for our Minnesota legislature overall. But I do remember the trip out there and how excited I was to visit with people like David Gergen, who awarded the award. And so thank you. That was a cool thing.
And for the educators and the leaders and the influence makers and the advocates listening to this Bold by Choice podcast, I really also want to say sometimes just keep things simple. Go back to the core principles. that there should be more than one provider of public education in a community. That's a pretty simple concept, but a powerful one. Another one is, why are charter schools thriving? Well, fundamentally, one reason, because students and parents choose them for their education. Nobody's assigned to them. Everybody there is choice. And that's a powerful thing when people choose you. I think the third thing I'd say is this idea that when you're doing something new, you don't know if it's going to work. And chartering does not create schools. It creates the opportunity for people to do something new and different. And when you do that, some people are going to have amazing ideas and implement them with fidelity, and it's going to work. Other people might not have so many great ideas and it doesn't work, or they got great ideas and they just can't implement it well. That's the point of enabling legislation. It is not a prescriptive model. It gives people a structure to try new and different. And some amazing things have grown out of that and will continue. And I want to slide one more thing in here for Don Cooper, because we often lament, boy, I wish schools and education didn't have politics in them. And that's true in many ways, but fundamentally, charter schools are a legislative political creation. And Don, I'm wondering if you'd just give us a minute on that.
You know, if we could only remove the politics from schools, well, in public education, the reality is you can't. And there are a few reasons for that. One is anything that involves the allocation of government resources, like money, like time, like buildings, all the things that go into a school are just inherently political because there's a competition over them. Do we put more money into schools or into roads or into cleaning the environment? What sites do schools go on? I mean, that's just the tension that we have within the way that we allocate resources through the political system. The second reason why public education is inherently political is a lot of times we think about it as, from a pedagogical sense, what's going to be taught. But when you step back, public education is about statecraft. So it's about what gets taught in a way that kind of binds a nation or a group of people together to convey common values. In America, our shared democratic values, for example. And there's always a tension over what those are, how much of the curricula is focused on that versus other things. It's just inherent in the system. And over time in public education, we've seen the progressive era, which was really trying to unify the nation around certain things, and then the civil rights era, which had a different focus, and the excellence in education era. But those were all about what values are we trying to convey in our schools. And that's a political decision in a lot of ways. I don't mean partisan political, I mean small p political on things, because it's about what makes us a nation, what makes us a people. Something that I really love about chartering is because you're able to try new things in the chartering space, you're able to bring in different perspectives and different approaches. So it's kind of like a federalist approach where we're able to live in a big system all at once, where we get some of our shared democratic values, and a little system where we have a school that's tailored to the needs of an individual community all at the same time. And I think there's a lot of power in that. And I think that's very reflective of the American spirit that our nation was founded on.
I love it, Don. And when I was helping found and lead the Michigan Association of Public School Academies, Michigan's charter association, I used to call us the Michigan Miracle. And people would be like, why do you say that? And I said, well, a lot of reasons, but one of them, it's a miracle that charters actually exist. If you understood the legal, the political, the regulatory attacks, the battle in the courts, it was an amazing thing that charters existed. It was the Michigan Miracle. Ember, I'm going to extend that. The alliteration works. The Minnesota Miracle. Thanks for leading that forward and telling us the story.
Thank you. We already have a Minnesota Miracle, though. That's already taken, but I love it. Thank you.
Wow, what a story. And thank you all for your time and the gift of sharing your experiences and your expertise. Well, as we get ready to head toward closing, Jim, do you have a challenge for our listeners today?
I do. The mighty Mississippi River ends in Louisiana. But the question is, where does it start? And Ember knows the answer to that. It starts in Lake Itasca in northern Minnesota. And you can literally walk across it and jump across it. You wouldn't try that in Louisiana. But that's the birth of chartering. A little idea, small, seems insignificant, but over time it grows, it brings more people into it, and it flows across the country like the mighty Mississippi. And we know it's making a difference for kids and for families and for educators. And I just want everybody out there listening to this to be like, hey, I'm taking the pledge. I'm going to be bold by choice. I'm going to put ideas into action, and I'm going to keep fighting, because we are on the side of angels. And we're not just making education better in schools called charters. We're using the chartering strategy to improve the whole of education. And fundamentally, state lawmakers have a constitution that they have to uphold. And every constitution talks about the importance of education. Don's spoken of that in many ways. I'm sure it'll come up in future legacy lessons. But we are in the work of transforming lives and transforming education so it works better for kids and communities and educators across this great country. So I love to be part of the Bold by Choice podcast and this team. And Ember, thanks again for sharing the story.
Well, if you enjoyed today's show, I am actually excited to share with you that Zero Chance of Passage, which is Ember's book, is available. You can grab your copy at www.charterlibrary.org. We'll also have the link directly in the show notes. So if you want to pop open your podcast app, check out today's show notes. You'll see the link there. The audiobook and the ebook are available. We've also added additional resources. So if you're like me and you like to understand the history, we are sharing articles and artifacts from the Founders Library to help you color in the lines so that you can take yourself on this journey through the charter history right there at home. Also, in your show notes are the leadership lessons. So I love hearing Jim, Don, and Ember pull out these really key moments. So we have put a few of them in the show notes for you to check out if you want to use this episode and those leadership lessons with your school team. So all of those are in the show notes right there directly for you to grab it. Now, we will be back next week, same time, same station, and we're going to keep going into the next part of the story. The next piece is we start to talk about the federal commitment with behind-the-scenes insight from Senator Dave Durenberger and many others who helped launch the movement across state lines. So be sure to follow the show, share, tag someone, leave us a review, and let's keep shaping our kids' futures together.